I often meet people along the course of life who have some very strong, vivid memories or plentiful memories from their early life. So let's say, I remember when I was 2 and this, I remember when I was 3 and this. And I don't have very many memories from my early age. But, there's nothing that sears a memory, even in early age, quite like childhood trauma. We laugh, of course, sometimes to cope, but I had a very, I would say, I don't know if we could call it traumatic, but even just an intense negative experience when I was younger by getting lost in an airport. Anyone get lost in an airport when they were 4 years old? Well, come along for the tale. So I remember a little about this, but all I can remember from my 4-year-old brain is that I was in the airport and then somehow I just couldn't see my parents. I looked around, they weren't there, and so somehow I had this feeling that they were just a little bit down. We were in the terminal, and of course how these airport terminals are, these very long corridors, so I thought they were a little bit down this way. So I started kind of speeding up a little bit, just to kind of try to catch up, but then I couldn't see them. So little by little, I just kind of ran a little bit further and started going faster and faster, but I couldn't find them. And of course, my mom describes it as like, we were just right there if you just turned your head, but I didn't understand. I just thought that it was just around over that next pass, just past that next pillar, just a little bit further, and I'll get to the thing I was looking for, and then it wasn't there. And so, of course, I have very fuzzy memory of it, but I just broke down crying. Thankfully, a good Samaritan found me. I don't even know who it was. I just remember somehow being ushered to some sort of information station where I found a nice and safe person, where they called out my name on the intercom, and my mom came. So of course, from my parents' perspective, there's also another version of trauma. My mom describes it as, well, we just thought we lost him at that point. That was done. He was taken and gone with, but thankfully, the good Samaritans prevailed and brought me together. But I just remember that feeling as a child, just feeling like there's just a little bit there, a little bit over there. If I just ran a little bit further, I would get to it. But, and then eventually just falling down, or not falling down, but just breaking down in despair. And I think a lot of this, and I wanted to bring this story because I think a lot of us have actually very similar experiences, if not with a physical, just trying to reach around the corner, but a lot of us have this kind of experience with God. As we are going through this series on spiritual toxins, I've noticed a lot of people, they feel like this feeling, as I hear them describing it, it's like my satisfaction with my feeling with God, or God's satisfaction with me, is just around the other corner. And so we start sort of running up to try to catch our satisfaction with God, or I almost kind of catch up with him. He's on the move, so I want to go get him. But then like almost the faster we run, the more that we feel like we're behind. And then I often hear people experience this feeling like they're never, ever pleased, feeling that sense of being pleased with by God. That they're always somehow in the wrong, and that they can never quite have this satisfaction. They're always reaching out and trying to reach that acceptance which they haven't quite found. And I think what this does for a lot of us is it causes us just kind of break down. It causes us to break down and kind of lose ourselves, and we just kind of give up, and what's the point? It can be very exhausting to constantly working and striving for our faith, and so a lot of ourselves along the way sort of get succumbed by other interests along the way. We've been going, reaching after, but because the satisfaction is never there, something kind of comes in the way that either maybe distracts us or pulls us away from our faith, because we have felt this sort of sense of helplessness in achieving some sort of satisfaction with our faith. And I liken this sometimes to, and this is going to shift things a little bit, impulse buys at a store. You guys know what I'm talking about, those impulse buys. As you go to a store, there's all that rack of things that you can just kind of purchase there. Work with me here a bit. It's like, how does the reaching and the impulse buys? But what in your mind, just think, what do you think is like the worst impulse buy you ever made? Just think about it for a second. Maybe it was something, or maybe a recent, anybody have an example? Something that maybe even recently you're like, oh man, I just impulse bought that. It's like, oh man, I regret it immediately. John.
I bought a really expensive pair of glasses
Oh no, there you go. Cancel, cancel, cancel. Anyone else? Maybe one more example. Anyone have a recent impulse buy?
This one's a real monster. I once spent, I won't give you the amount, but bought a leather jacket, and that was probably in itself unwise, but it was the wrong size. I sent it back, and they never gave me
Oh
a
no.
larger size, and I lost the money.
Oh no.
Dad bought me a watch for a birthday,
Yeah?
and it broke.
Oh no. I was trying to search for like an example of a really expensive one to make it really juicy. One of the best examples I could think of was it wasn't super expensive, but it was more like the quantity of things. I once went to the store. This was back in the ancient world of DVDs. Anyone remember that time when you got physical discs and you put them into a player and So I was wanting to get some DVDs. I'm like, I need to boost my collection. So I was just kind of I think it was Future Shop at the time, again, dating myself. And I just went to the rack and I just bought like a bunch of DVDs. 'Cause I was like, I want to watch these DVDs. And I think I might have watched a couple of them. Probably about 5 of them I maybe watched once. Maybe another couple I didn't watch at all. And my wife, of course, is very well aware of this because she sometimes the emblem of my impulse buys that I never actually use are kind of like in our house. She's like, grr, it's in my house. It's taking my time. Why? But it's kind of like you're like, oh, I just kind of bought it on an impulse, but it just didn't really satisfy. And what I think is happening, and I'm no psychologist, so I'm sure the psychologist can come in and sort of help us understand exactly psychologically what's happening here. But I think as I observe this, impulse buys and all these other impulses that we have are almost taking the place of these deep desires that we have. We buy a leather jacket because we want to be cool or fashionable. We buy these DVDs because we want to have recreation. And we have these inner desires, the thing that we've been chasing after and that we might get to. But because we don't feel like we've been able to attain it, we kind of settle for these impulsive things that we think will satisfy. And of course, from leather jackets to, John, what was your example again? The glasses, that's right, of course. From leather jackets to glasses to all these things. We think it'll satisfy, but so often it doesn't. And which is why I think it's very good that Jesus preempts this, or the authors of this passage preempt the story we just read, which we'll get to in a moment, with this story of the feeding of the 5,000. In Mark chapter 8, if you want to open it up, because we're in Mark chapter 8. We begin in chapter 8 with the feeding of the 5,000. And we know this story. We won't read this section word for word. We'll get to a little bit section, but we know this story. It's about a lot of people are hungry, and so they are fed. Jesus miraculously multiplies the loaves and the fishes so that the multitudes, the 5,000, are fed. And I think this is part of a larger effort that he's demonstrating 2 things. First of all, he cares about our needs. We just prayed in the Lord's Prayer. Jesus invites us through the Lord's Prayer to pray for our daily bread. And Jesus is also demonstrating the kingdom of God, demonstrating his godness, his godship, his God self, the godness of himself, in that he's able to do these miraculous signs. And yet, even Jesus, as he is doing these miracles, and yes, feeding and tending her souls, he knows that there's a deeper longing. There's something that we have been kind of running and searching for, trying to get to as a child, searching for their father in a lost airport. We are running and searching for this thing, and yes, food is something we need. It's a physical need that we have, but there's something deeper. This story is immediately followed starting in verse 14 with the story of the healing of a blind man. Or actually, no, we're not getting the blind man yet. First, we talk about this story in verse 14, where they're on the road again. In verse 14, the disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf that they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. So here Jesus is, we've talked about this passage a while ago, where Jesus is kind of warning them to not follow after the Pharisees who are not following God's way in the way that Jesus would want them. So he's saying, be warned of them. They're going to turn you to legalism. They're going to turn you away from the kingdom of God. Be aware, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees. They discussed this with one another and said, it's because we have no bread. And Jesus goes on, he says, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you not see or understand? He basically chastises them for not getting the bigger picture. You know, sometimes when we have these immediate needs, they feel real at the time. From an impulse buy where we feel that need for those glasses or that jacket, to all the other things that come and the distractions come into our life, they can often seem to satisfy the thing that we truly need. And hunger is a great example of that, because we do need to eat. And yet Jesus here is trying to give hints at something deeper, a longing, a desire that is much further beyond the immediacy of hunger, and yet that's all they can think of. In the chapter 6 of the book of John, many of you might already know this part of the story. There also is a story of the feeding the 5,000. So John, the author, tells that story. But then afterwards, Jesus is talking to the crowds and talking about he is the bread of life, as if to invite them to think, yes, I did feed you in the immediacy of what your impulses need right now, but there's something deeper that I'm here to demonstrate, is that even while you are hungry, you hunger for something even more. Even the woman at the well in John chapter 4, she was looking for water, but Jesus is like, what I can give you is living water that satisfies. And so, in order to demonstrate this in the path of this story, Jesus moves on from there, and a few verses later, starting in verse 22, Jesus further demonstrates this with the healing of this blind man. In verse 22, it says, they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on his man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, do you see anything? He looked up and he said, I see people. They look like trees walking around. Jesus is giving hints that there is something more to what he is. Yes, he is healing the blind. Yes, he is giving food to the hungry. But there's something more that he is demonstrating. He's leading up to it. He's trying to bring all the people around him out of the immediacy of these impulses, out of their blindness, out of their hunger, and to give hints at something deeper. And so Jesus comes to this with the story that this is actually a story before what John, so immediately before what John read for us John started reading in verse 31. We see in verse 22, Jesus starts to peel back the curtain a bit, show a little bit more about what he's doing to Peter, one of his closest disciples there. He says, Jesus and his disciples were on the villages of Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, who do people say that I am? So I've been doing all these miracles. I've been feeding these immediate needs. They have hunger, they have blindness, they have these impulses. They want Gucci jackets. They want Gucci jackets, Gucci glasses, leather jackets. They want all these things. And I've been providing them their impulse. And maybe he didn't provide them that, but he's been providing the immediate needs. But below that, there's something deeper. So he's asking them, who do they say that I am? And they replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. But then Jesus asks, but what about you? Who do you say that I am? And I think this is a very important turning point in this little segment of chapter 8 in Mark. Because Jesus has began this chapter by sort of satisfying the immediate needs. But this is where Jesus sort of turns the story and says, this is not just simply about me, the miracle worker, me, the prophet, me, the person who's able to provide all these impulses. I want to ask you, after you, Peter, have seen everything that I have done, who do you say that I am? And thankfully, he responds correctly. Oh, no, that's for a little bit later. He responds correctly and says, you are the Messiah. You are the Messiah. You see, a lot of us in our faith, I began by saying that a lot of us feel this way in our faith, that we're kind of reaching out for this satisfaction with God, but then other impulses come in the way and distract us away. It's almost like we forget, right? I mean, I'm with you. We forget the goodness of God. We forget the wonderfulness of his kingdom, the satisfaction we have with him, the acceptance and the love that we have from him. And it's almost because we have this perception that we need to constantly struggle for it and race for it. It's just around the corner. We too often allow impulses to come into our lives. And we do have hunger. We do have blindness in one sense. We do have needs for physical things. But these things can distract us away from what is most important. And it's this observation that I noted at the very beginning of the sermon that a lot of us face. It's these kinds of things, these barriers between us and God that I call spiritual toxins. That's been the name of this series. We've been talking about those. Spiritual toxins, this is not a biblical phrase. This is just my phrase to refer to the things that form barriers between us and God. And so we've been talking about a number of different spiritual toxins as have been listed already. But today, I'm referring specifically to these next three kinds of spiritual toxins. The kinds of things that as we go on in our life of faith, as we're striving, as we struggle with that feeling of constantly striving and not being enough for God, here are the things that I observe in myself and in others that often take us away from God. The impulse buys of our faith. Distractions, busyness, and selfishness. It can be very easy for us to replace the goodness of God's kingdom with these three things, especially with all the stuff that's around us. Like you can imagine the people in the Jesus day probably didn't have as much abundance of food as we have today. So when there was a feeding of 5,000 people, boy, I'm sure that got around. It's like, here's a man who's satisfying our needs. And yet here we are in a culture, we're experiencing the mega abundance of that. With our modern technology, we're feeding more than 5,000. We're feeding almost everyone. Even there is poverty, there is homelessness in the city of Guelph, and yet one thing that I hear pretty much pervasively across Ontario is that the one need that we're able to provide for pretty much anyone is food. Now, often it's a little harder, of course, that there are various different levels of government service and assistance is required, but there is almost no one, as far as I'm aware, and I've had kind of experts in the field tell me this, almost no one that's literally starving to death. That satisfied is being needed by the grace of God, and we can celebrate that. And yet, the thing that Jesus would remind us is that it's not about the bread. It's not about the provision. We can appreciate and welcome the abundance, but it's almost in this wealth of abundance that just like the disciples did, they just start making everything about the bread, everything about our needs, everything about the things that we need, that immediacy of things. And I wonder if it's because, I often wonder about this in my own self. Why do I trade these distractions, busyness, selfishness? You recognize these things as well. I have these as well. Distractions, anything from circumstance in our life, and especially with the technology, the abundance of the blessing of technology. We have an abundance of technological distractions, from social media to scrolling through TikTok or Reels or whatever it is. There's an abundance of distractions. Netflix series, and believe me, I've said this before, you know I like me some Stranger Things, so I can binge watch a series like The Best of Us. But I notice myself, like it's about balance, right? I notice myself consistently falling prey to that distraction and leaving aside richness with God for even more distraction, for even more of that. There's nothing wrong with a good scroll session, but if that's all we're doing, we're replacing something that is beautiful and majestic for something very trivial. And yet we feel like we need it at that time. And that's the thing that I was trying to think about as I was preparing this, is like, what is making me distracted away from this thing that I know is even more satisfying? Well, it's a story that plays out in human history. The disciples are talking about bread. The people, they can't get their mind around the immediacy. And even while there is something that we're striving for, we sometimes lose that sense of urgency. If only we could always feel like we are lost in the airport, right? If only we could capture that feeling and capture that urgency where it's like we need to constantly strive and strive and strive for this, but yet at the same time, even the constant striving sometimes leads us to simply just break down and trade in those distractions because we feel like it is hopeless. Busyness is similar to distraction in that we fill our lives with so many things because we think this will satisfy, this program, this activity, this thing will satisfy, and we layer it on. And none of these things are necessarily individually bad. Sports programs aren't bad. Clubs and different programs aren't bad, but it gets loaded into our life and we forget the thing that ultimately satisfies. We lose that sense of pursuit of God and trade it in for something that's more superficial. And of course, at the end of the day, and I notice this in myself, sometimes it's just pure selfishness. I want that thing. I want to do that. I want to do that thing. That thing is a lot. We were talking a bit about this in our Bible chat this morning at 9 a.m., where we were just talking about like what, other things that seem like they are more satisfying, and we almost see it as a detriment. So we get tempted into that feeling of selfishness because we want these things. We want that bread. We want our blindness to be healed in the immediacy, and yet we forget the richness of what is underneath it in a pursuit of God. And so the series is called Spiritual Detox. How do we take this toxin, these distractions, this busyness, that selfishness? What is something we can do to help us get this out of our lives? And I like, and one of the things, and because basically what we need to do is we need to let go. We're often hanging on to this thing for a variety of reasons, because this helps us cope, or because we're feeling the immediacy of the need, or because of a sense of helplessness somewhere else. We're hanging on, and in one sense, we need to give ourselves an opportunity to let go. But too often, that is a very abstract. I mean, many of us have probably heard that sermon before. Oh, you got to let go and let God. But many people have asked me, like, what exactly does that mean? So I'm going to give you some concrete examples for all of us to follow, so that it's more than just the abstract letting go. But before we get into the examples come under the theme of the passage that we just read. So actually the passage begins a little further. John read for us from 31 to 33. And that first section, 31 through 33, remember John read, Peter was basically denying the resurrection. It says in verse 31, he began to teach them many things, that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the teacher of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. And you can imagine Peter in this circumstance. No, you die? No, we can't have that. He was struck with the immediacy of what he needed at that time. He needed his mentor at that time to live. But when Jesus turned around at his disciples, he rebuked Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." He said, "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." And many of us are confused by that phrasing. I know I myself wonder, what is it that he's calling him Satan? Because denying the resurrection, denying what Jesus needs to do in order for us to be saved and to redeemed, is the definition of the enemy. We must begin by acknowledging that Jesus had to die for us. We must begin by staring into that reality. It's not all just fluff and rainbows, that there was a death, there was an immediacy of a circumstance that had to happen. All of our pursuits, all of our faith pursuits would be nothing if it wasn't for the resurrection. The resurrection is the thing that brought the power of God into our world and also demonstrated the immense love of God for us. It is our guiding star, and yet it is the thing that we have to remember that is not something we have to continually strive for. If only I was, as a little 4-year-old boy, able to just turn around and notice that my parents were, in fact, right there. I just had to turn around. How many times have our parents said that? Just turn around, it's right there. It's under the thing, you just got to look for it. But it's right there. It's right there. And Jesus' love, Jesus' embrace is right there, but it's because of the resurrection. We might think we need Jesus to do as we would want him to do. Peter would have had Jesus not die, but Jesus had to rebuke him and say, "Get behind me, Satan," or adversary, person who is against me, because I'm not going to do things by your terms. I am going to do this in a way that is going to be ultimately for your benefit. That's not going to satisfy your impulse of you feeling what you need, but I am going to be the thing that's going to provide you that ultimate satisfaction, and you need to get behind and trust me. So the first part of this is simply recognizing and coming back into terms with the reality of Jesus' resurrection and the resurrection power that is here. And we're getting examples of how we do this in a second, but we also follow in what Jesus said afterwards. Because in verse 34, he says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." This exactly follows with what had just happened. It's not about yourself and your needs or what you need from me. You need to take up your cross and follow him. Deny yourself. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? I think a lot of us experience this even in our human relationships. Sometimes we know the feeling of things either in marriage or in our friendship getting a little stale. It's because sometimes we turn to these impulses that don't satisfy, and yet the encouragement that Jesus is reminding us is that we have to kind of die to ourself. In one way, we can kind of say it, die to that sense of us defining our needs. Because too often we'll replace the really good thing with that impulse buy. Too often we'll trade in satisfaction for something that is fleeting. Sometimes we'll trade in the truth for a false narrative. We'll trade in the idea that Jesus has already died, already resurrected, already purchased your sin for some sort of thought that we have to continually be running for and striving for and reaching for our acceptance. But our faith is not like that young Ryan who was constantly looking for that satisfaction around the corner. Our faith, our satisfaction is just here. It's been paid for on the cross and is available to all. And yet, we do need to deny ourselves. We have to take up our cross because we can too easily be distracted. We can too often reach for those impulse buys. And so how do we practice this? I said there's going to be some practical examples because that letting go can be a little bit abstract. In a sense, it all boils down to this one word: sacrifice. We've already discussed a number of different remedies for our spiritual toxins: rest, silence, praise, lament. But this week we're talking about sacrifice. There are many ways to practice sacrifice, practice that denying of ourself. We are doing it already here today. And in fact, in one sense, congratulations. Some of you might have gone through a lot to even make it here today. For many of us, it's a rhythm. It's a rhythm that we appreciate because we know that this is good for our souls. But for some of us, it might have taken everything we needed in order to get ourselves here this morning. And I say, well done. Because being part of this, it's not because being in a building with some dude with a blue shirt is in itself beneficial. It's that decision to sacrifice your time for the sake of God. To sacrifice, yes, I could be doing so many other things this morning, but I'm going to sacrifice this time so that God can lead me. I have a lot of impulse buys around me. I could do this on a Sunday morning, I could do that on a Sunday morning, but I'm going to sacrifice that for the sake of reaching that deeper, more satisfying thing. To be reminded that my satisfaction with God is not something that's just around the next terminal corner, but has already been purchased on the cross, something that I am so easy to forget. That bread is not the thing that I really need, that the bread of life is the thing that I need. So congratulations, you're already here, and keep it up. In your own life, in your family life, adopt this as a rhythm. Because we can so easily forget. It's not that we have to be here, it's that we get to be here. because we get to be reminded that what ultimately satisfies is God. There are other practical ways that we can sacrifice. We can sacrifice our time for serving. I gave a plug for it earlier in the service. We can use our time. It's a kind of sacrifice. I mean, what many of you will say, and I'll say it for my own testimony. Oftentimes, even after the sacrifice, you notice that there is benefit and gain as you serve, as you use your gifts, as you bless the kingdom or bless the church. You find it comes back to you over and over again, which is indeed the kingdom of God. It's the story of the gospel. It's how abundance had to be purchased by great sacrifice. But sometimes it's an initial sting, right? If you're not already in the habit of serving or using your gifts, it's another responsibility. It's another bother. It's another thing that I have to do. But I tell you, I think you know in your own life, and that many here will tell the story, that when you get to using your gifts actively, whether in this portion of the kingdom or beyond, whether Michael House or in other areas of God's kingdom, by using your gifts and sort of sacrificing your time and your talent for that, it reminds us, it reconnects us back to that thing that satisfies and wards off those impulse buys. Tithing and giving financially is another one of those things. It can be sometimes sticky because sometimes people look at the church and say all they want is their money. It's just simply a matter of, it's one of the things that we have, right? God has given this to us. And so the question we all have to ask ourselves is, who better can use this lump of funds that I have? I have these resources, I have my talents, I have my time, I have my attention, but I also have these financial resources. And what could be done if that was given to God's work? Could, in fact, God's work be multiplied more? Could we see more people come to know God? Could we see his goodness more multiplied? So I'm going to sacrifice that leather jacket or Gucci sunglasses. Sorry, you guys are like low-lying fruit. There you go. I'm going to sacrifice those things in order to see God's goodness and kingdom reign. It's another example. But this week, we're going to practice a very particular, so all of these things we can practice at any time, but this week I want to introduce for us a very specific practice, a practice of sacrifice that I have found very beneficial in my life, is something that Scripture leads us to, and that's the practice of fasting. Now, it's not something we do very commonly here in our culture, and I think it makes complete sense. Why? Because I just talked about how our culture is all about abundance. So the idea of limiting ourselves or fasting from something is like strange to our culture. And we've all been sort of convinced that that's not really what God wants for us to do. And yet it's laden throughout Scripture as a spiritual practice that draws us to God. But here's the thing about fasting. Many of us think that fasting is just about, or at least in our culture, that fasting is just about sort of doing something sacrificial, as if kind of experiencing some pain for God and that sort of something, sort of doing something negative so that God can be increased. Here's what fasting is about. It's about adopting the practice of sacrifice so that you turn to God for what you need in life. People often don't understand this about fasting. Is really one of the functions of fasting. And we know that we can fast from food, but many people commonly fast from other things, maybe at technology or any other kinds of fast. When we take out something that we normally rely upon something, it draws us to rely upon God. So it's not that the suffering is, in this case, that is invoked through fasting is sort of regenerative in itself. The purpose of fasting is to withhold from us something that we need in order so that God might provide our needs. It's as we're walking throughout the day and we feel that hunger pang, either literal or metaphorical, depending on what we're fasting from, it reminds us viscerally that we need to rely upon God. When I practice fasting, and sometimes I might do like a day fast where I'm just abstaining from food for a day, I simply just abstain from food for a day, and then every time I feel that hunger pang, it just simply leads me to pray. And so sometimes I'm just doing work or out and about, buying groceries. And so I feel that hunger pang, and even the quickness of that moment, I can then be led to pray in a way that I may not have done before because I'm just surrounded by abundance, all the impulse buys around me. But then when I'm at home and I feel that hunger pang, it draws me into maybe a deeper time of prayer, a more intentional time of prayer. I have found sometimes hunger fast work for me. Sometimes fasting from technology in one way or another has often been helpful in my life. I might do a day or a couple days where I just say, you know what, except for work where I need to use my laptop or whatever, I'm just going to fast from technology entirely. I'm going to not, just for these couple days, not watch Netflix or YouTube or TikTok or whatever it is. I'm just going to have a technology fast. And you feel a similar pang, right? Because whenever I'm fasting that way, gosh, sometimes this thing can be even more hunger pang worthy than even just food, right? We're all, in some sense, at least my generation and below, kind of addicted to those things, right? So when we fast from that, just like we could do with food, when we feel that hunger pang to reach for it, it draws us to pray. It draws us to find our sufficiency in God. And we can layer on all sorts of different practices on top of it. You can layer on different readings or whatever kind of thing. But at the very basis, it's a way for us to say, I'm going to spend this day or this period of time, whatever the period of fasting is, for me to be drawn closer in reliance upon God, to have more time in prayer. And so we in our discipling communities, is what we're calling our small groups, and we've invited everybody in the church to be part of one. If you're not part of one, please do talk to me because I'd love to connect you with one. This is what we're going to be practicing in our discipling communities this week. So you will talk about it at your discipling community. You will prepare for however you're going to fast. I've recommended each group leader or pair of group leaders, I've given them freedom to kind of do it however they wish. The standard recommendation is to choose a day within the next week period, starting from your group to your next group meeting. Choose a day where you're going to do a day fast. That's kind of the standard recommendation. So it'd be nice to be able to do it all together on the same day because you can kind of encourage each other through the day. If you have a group chat or whatever, say, how are you doing? But sometimes, depending on the group, that may not be practicable, so that's why I'm trying to make it more flexible. But have a day of fasting. And the question of what exactly do we abstain, you can talk about that in a group because there's so many different ways to do it. You can choose to fast from food or technology. This is all going to be talked about in your groups, and you're going to practice the practice of fasting together. And so I look forward to hearing about how that goes because sometimes you need that encouragement from others to get going on these practices, and so that's the nature of this series. We learn about something in our sermons, then we practice in our discipling communities, and we report back and say, how did that go? Did that draw you closer to God? Was it total failure? How did it go? And we walk along our journey of faith together. So a quick plug, if you're not already part of a discipling community, please do reach out to me so I can get you part of one. We also have these fancy-dancy pamphlets, which are out there, which thank you very much, Rena, for preparing these. This also has a summary as to where and when and where they meet. But I'm here to help you as well. So, may you all, as we go and experience this together, know that the impulse buys of our life, whether physical or metaphorical, won't satisfy. May we be invited into the practice of sacrifice, whether through serving or tithing or even fasting, so that we might turn our gaze away from the things that are immediate and reach the depth of our relationship with God, and thereby find ourselves closer with God, knowing that He is right there with us and not just around the corner. Amen.